Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Golgari horror, Old Stickfingers. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to buy me a coffee in the link in the description below to keep me caffeinated as I work on these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders you can vote for in the comments for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Old Stickfingers is a star horror that costs X, a black and a green, with the following abilities. When you cast a spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then put the rest at the bottom of your deck in a random order. Old Stickfingers' power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you have in your graveyard. Right out of the gate, we can see that our commander's variable mana cost and stat line are both linked to the state of our graveyard, with its abilities letting us dump more bodies into it and making it bigger respectively. Looking more in depth into our commander's first ability, it easily lets us dump multiple creatures into our graveyard depending on how much mana we pump into it while leaving our other card types in our deck, making it a powerful source of graveyard setup for our creatures that, while not as accurate as Entomb or Buried Alive, will still always guarantee that X creatures will end up in our grave so long as we have them in our deck. This then feeds nicely into his second ability, which makes our commander bigger and bigger as we continue to toss our creatures into our bin through his ability and other sources, making our commander a very real threat on the board that will just keep growing at the same rate our graveyard does. So now that we know what Old Stickfingers does, how do we make the most of our graveyard-centric commander? Going all in on a creature-heavy self-mill strategy is certainly one way to do it, turning our commander into a juggernaut that's more than capable of 1 to 2-shotting our opponents as we dump as much of our deck as possible into the grave. From there, it's just a matter of suiting up Old Stickfingers with ways to protect him, making him evasive, and pumping him even further with some graveyard-flavored abilities such as Scavenge, and we would have the makings of a very interesting Voltron-style deck. This build, however, ended up going in a very different direction, caring less about the quantity of creatures in our graveyard and more about the quality. Since our commander excels at getting creatures into our graveyard, if we ensure that those creatures are big and scary, we can then easily cheat them into play with reanimation spells. So while our creature count is going to be a bit on the lower side, their stats and abilities certainly won't be, each of them packing big numbers to hit hard, reliable evasion to get through blockers, and potent effects to enable us or disrupt our opponents. And while most of our big creatures will have big mana values to match, we'll rarely be hard casting them, as we'll be running enough reanimation spells to make any necromancer proud, ensuring that we can get the creatures into play well ahead of curve once our commander entombs them or another effect sends them to the graveyard, whether it be ours or our opponent's. Now, let's see if our opponent's barricades will hold up against our onslaught from beyond the grave, as Old Stickfingers has no shortage of bodies to throw at them. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Skipping all the way to the CMC 5 slot, we have its two entrants with Bloodgift Demon and Drana the Last Bloodchief. Bloodgift Demon is a 5/4 flyer that has target player draw a card and lose a life on each of our upkeeps, making it a decent source of card advantage as well as being a big evasive body to swing in with. Drana is a 4/4 flyer that, whenever she attacks, has defending player choose a non-legendary creature in our graveyard for us to return into play with a +1/+1 counter on it, providing us with a recurable source of reanimation that makes its target even bigger whenever it procs. Moving on to the CMC 6 slot, we have a trio of black creatures joining our ranks with Demon of Dark Schemes, Necropolis Regent, and Reaper from the Abyss. Demon of Dark Schemes is a 5/5 flyer that, when it ETBs, has all creatures lose -2/-2 until end of turn, as well as passively gaining an energy every time another creature dies, which we can spend 4 of, as well as 2 and a black to put a creature from a graveyard back into play, tapped under our control, serving as a big evasive beater that provides a small board clear when it ETBs and can reanimate both our own and our opponent's creatures at instant speed easily and repeatedly. Necropolis Regent is a 6/5 flyer that has any creature we control that deals combat damage to a player gain +1/+1 counters equal to that damage, giving us another large evasive body that will pump both itself and our other creatures exponentially turn after turn, putting our opponents on a clock unless they're able to both get rid of it and the creatures it grew while it was around. Reaper from the Abyss is a 6/6 flyer that, on each end step, destroys a non-demon creature so long as a creature died that turn, making it a repeatable source of removal with an easy-to-fulfill condition that we can also safely swing in with for sizable damage. Entering the CMC 7 slot, we start off with a trio of demons in the form of Demon of Loathing, Overseer of the Damned, and Rune-Scarred Demon. Demon of Loathing is a 7/7 flyer with trample that, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, has that player sack a creature. giving us our biggest stat line yet with 2 forms of evasion to punch through even flying blockers, and even adding some edict removal as a bonus for some additional disruption. Overseer of the Damned is a 5/5 flyer that, when it ETBs, destroys a creature, and, whenever a non-token creature our opponent's controls dies, creates a tapped 2/2 zombie token, making it a triple threat as both another evasive beat stick, a source of creature removal, and a way to grow our board by flooding it with zombies as our opponent's creatures die, all of which we'll happily take. Runescarred Demon is a 6/6 flyer that, when it ETBs, searches our library for any card and puts it into our hand, making it a good tutor effect that only gets better if our opponents destroy it, which lets us tutor again when we reanimate it, or, if they don't get rid of it, lets us use its big stats to crash into our opponent's life totals instead. The latter half of this slot then brings us Butcher of Malakir, Giant Ataphage, and Moldgraph Monstrosity. Butcher of Malakir is a 5/4 flyer that has each opponent sack a creature whenever it or another one of our creatures die, serving as a decent attacker that punishes our opponents if they decide to turn their removal onto our creatures by picking apart our opponent's boards as retaliation. Giant Ataphage is a 7/7 with trample that creates a token of itself whenever it deals combat damage to a player, its ability allowing it to completely take over the game by allowing it to make more and more copies of itself every time it swings in unless quickly dealt with or wiping the board. Moldgraph Monstrosity is an 8/8 with trample that, when it dies, exiles itself and brings 2 random creatures from our grave back into play, putting our opponents in the awkward position of letting us swing in with an 8/8 trample every turn, or removing it and letting us put 2 potentially bigger creatures back into play instead, leaving us happy regardless of the outcome. The CMC 8 slot is up next with its pair of entrants, those being Pestilence Demon and Villis, Broker of Blood. Pestilence Demon is a 7/6 flyer that we can pay a black to have it deal 1 damage to each creature and each player, making it a decent menacing to keep the board clear of most of our opponent's creatures while largely ignoring ours thanks to their big stat lines, all while being an impressive attacker on its own. Villis is an 8/8 flyer that we can pay a black and 2 life to give target creature -1/-1 until end of turn, and, whenever we lose a life, has us draw that many cards, giving us another evasive demon with a stat line to match that serves as both a non-destruction removal effect and a card draw effect all in a single potent package. Finally, reaching the CMC 9 slot, we have our final entry with Triplicate Titan, a 9/9 with Flying Vigilance and Trample that, when it dies, creates 3 3/3 tokens, 1 with Trample, 1 with Vigilance, and 1 with Flying, making it the biggest stat line in our deck and having the benefit of having 3 very relevant keywords and even leaving behind extra bodies when dealt with as a parting gift, all which is great for keeping our board presence even after a wipe. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have its single entry with Erebos' Intervention, an X spell that has us either have target creature lose -X/-X until end of turn while gaining us X life, or instead exiles twice X cards from any graveyards, giving us a flexible card that's capable of both non-destruction creature removal and a targeted graveyard hate effect in a single package. Moving on to the CMC 2 slot, we have some more removal options with Return to Nature, Wilt, and Golgari Charm. Return to Nature and Wilt can destroy an artifact or enchantment, the former also having the option to exile a card from any grave, while the latter has cycling for 2, making them both excellent sources of back row removal while having extra utility in the form of graveyard hate or cantripping, respectively. Golgari Charm lets us choose one of the following 3 effects. Each creature gains -1/-1 until end of turn, destroy target enchantment, or regenerate each creature we control, giving us a potent suite of options to either disrupt our opponents or keep our own board states intact as necessary. Entering the CMC 3 slot, we'll start off with even more removal in the form of Beast Within, Putrefy, and Bloodline Culling. Beast Within lets us destroy target permanent at the cost of giving its controller a 3/3 token, making it a very flexible removal spell to deal with almost any type of permanent threat with minimal downside. Putrefy has us either destroy target artifact or creature and prevents them from being regenerated, again serving as a good removal option against common threats and having some upside against regenerators if needed. Bloodline Culling has us either have target creature gain -5/-5 until end of turn, or have creature tokens gain -2/-2 until end of turn, giving us a decent non-destruction removal effect against single targets that we can turn into a board wipe against token-heavy decks as needed. Finally, we end this slot with Reincarnation, which has target creature's owner return a creature from their grave back into play under their control should the target creature die this turn, giving us a cheap instant speed reanimation spell that takes advantage of whenever our opponents try to remove our creatures by simply replacing them with another one from our bin. Moving along to the CMC 4 slot, we have its 2 entrants with Makeshift Mannequin and Death Sprout. Makeshift Mannequin lets us put a creature back into play from our graveyard with a mannequin counter on it, which causes it to be sacked if it's targeted by a spell or ability, making it an instant speed reanimation effect with some downside, but ultimately worth running thanks to its playability on our opponent's turns. Death Sprout has us destroy target creature, then put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, providing us with both removal and ramp, both of which are good in any deck. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot in our last instant, we have Return of the Wild Speaker, which has us either draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-humans we control, or instead gives all our non-humans +3/+3 until end of turn, serving as both a superb piece of card draw considering our big stat lines, or a finisher by boosting our creatures' already massive stat lines even further to help us close out the game. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we start off with a pair of ramp spells in the form of Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land from our deck into play tapped, the former fetching a basic and the latter fetching a non-forest with a basic land type, making them staple ramp spells to help us grow our mana base. Then we come to a trio of reanimation spells with Exhume, Persist, and Stitch Together. Exhume has each player put a creature from their grave back into play, which is still worth running despite it being symmetrical, since our creatures will usually be much bigger than our opponents, and can even occasionally skip our opponents entirely if they have no creatures to bring back. Persist has us put a non-legendary creature back into play from our grave with a -1/-1 counter on it, making it a very cheap reanimation spell with only a minor downside that will barely impact our creature's big stat lines anyway. Stitch Together lets us either bring a creature from our grave back into our hand or instead onto the field if we have 7 or more cards in our grave, usually being able to do the latter thanks to our commander's ability to fill our yard consistently for another cheap reanimation spell. Then we close out this slot with Sign in Blood, which has target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, giving us some staple card draw that can double as burn if we really need that extra reach to close out a game. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we have a couple of ramp spells with Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Nissa's Pilgrimage, each fetching us 2 lands from our deck, putting one into play tapped and the other into our hand, the first 2 doing so for basics, while the last being limited to basic forests, while having the upside of fetching 3 instead of 2 if we have 2+ instants or sorceries in our bin, all providing us with some potent ramp to keep our mana base growing nicely. Additionally, we'll also be running Search for Tomorrow, which has us put a basic land from our deck into play tapped and can be suspended for a green, giving us a good early ramp source and a passable later game one. Then we jump back on the reanimation plan with Victimize, Life and Death, and Entreat the Dead. Victimize has us sack a creature to bring 2 others back from our grave into play tapped, making it an easy way to reanimate 2 creatures for the price of 1, and doubles as a good way to get rid of our commander to use its ability again to fill our graveyard even further. Life and Death is a split card, its life side turning all our lands into 1/1s until end of turn, and its death side returning a creature from our grave into play at the cost of losing life equal to its CMC, which will usually be playing for its reanimation effect but can occasionally be used to weaponize our lands in the event that we need extra reach to close out a game. Entreat the Dead is a double X spell that lets us return X creatures from our grave into play and has Miracle for X and double black, giving us a scalable mass reanimation spell that just keeps getting better the more mana we pump into it, and which we can get a significant discount on if we manage to draw into it for its Miracle cost. Then we close out this slot with Read the Bones and Gaze of Granite. Read the Bones has a scry 2, draw 2, and lose 2 life, providing us with both card selection and card draw for a nominal life loss, which is a great rate to keep our hands full. Gaze of Granite is an X spell that destroys all non-land permanents of CMC X or less, making it a potent board wipe that devastates our opponent's boards while leaving ours mostly untouched thanks to our creatures' high CMC values. The CMC 4 slot is up next, starting off with some reanimation spells in the form of Vigor Mortis, Dread Return, and Zombify, all 3 of which return a creature from our grave back into play, the first doing so with a +1/+1 counter if we pay a green for its cost, the second having flashback by sacking 3 creatures, and the last having no additional effect, giving us a decent suite of reanimation spells that bring our creatures back ahead of curve. We'll also be adding Blood for Bones to our reanimation suite, which lets us sack a creature in order to return a creature in our grave back to hand and another one to the field, which serves as a good way to get our commander back into our hand to be cast again and entomb more creatures while reanimating another creature in the process. Then we have some draw options in the form of Ambition's Cost and Harmonize, both which allow us to draw 3 cards, with the former costing us 3 life and the latter having a more restrictive mana cost, providing us with some more draw to keep our hands nice and full throughout the course of the game. Finally, we close out this slot with Terramorph and Diabolic Tutor. Terramorph lets us put a basic land from our deck into play and has Rebound, which has it exile itself in order to do it again on our next upkeep, giving us some additional lands that come into play untapped to use that extra mana immediately if needed. Diabolic Tutor lets us search our deck for any card and put it into our hand, making it a good wild card to search up any card we may need for any given situation without revealing it to our opponents for that extra surprise factor. The CMC 5 slot then brings us even more reanimation spells with upside, starting with Bond of Revival, Unbreakable Bond, and Diagraph Rebirth, all 3 putting a creature from our grave back into play, the first giving it haste to swing in immediately, the second giving it a lifelink counter to let it gain us life every time it swings in, and the last costing 1 less for each creature that died this turn, as well as having flashback for 5 a black and a green for some nice 2-for-1 value, especially if we manage to kill some creatures beforehand. making them all good reanimation effects with upside that we can take advantage of. Then we have even more reanimation effects joining us with Incarnation Technique, Beacon of Unrest, and Living Death. Incarnation Technique has us mill 5 cards, then returns a creature from our grave back into play, allowing us to do it again thanks to Demonstrate at the cost of letting an opponent's copy the ability as well, giving us some good 2-for-1 reanimation value that gives us the option to choose an opponent with a weak creature base to offset its downside or even make deals for maximum benefit. Beacon of Unrest lets us return a creature or artifact from any graveyard back into play under our control, then shuffles itself back into our deck, serving as a decent reanimation effect for both our and our opponent's cards while having a chance to be seen multiple times per games thanks to its self-shuffling effect. Living Death has each player sack all the creatures they have in play and swap them in for all the creatures they have in their graveyard, making it a very powerful card that's both a board wipe and mass reanimation effect that can easily get us 30 plus power on the field if our graveyard is set up properly, while ruining our opponent's board states in the process. Finally, we close out this slot with Final Parting, which has us search 2 cards from our deck and puts one into our hand while putting the other into our grave, much like Diabolic Tutor, letting us tutor up any card we may need with the added benefit of dumping another huge body into our graveyard to reanimate as we do so. Reaching the CMC 6 slot, we come to our last trio of sorceries with Verdant Mastery, Ever After, and Rishkar's Expertise. Verdant Mastery lets us search our deck for 4 basic lands, putting 2 into play tapped and the rest into our hand. Or, if we pay the reduced cost of 3 and a green instead, has us put one of the searched lands into play under an opponent's control before we do this, which we'll usually be paying for its reduced costs to get as many lands out of our deck as quickly as possible to ensure we hit more reanimation spells throughout the course of the game. Ever After returns 2 creatures from our grave back into play and makes them black zombies in the process, putting itself back at the bottom of the deck after it does so, again giving us another 2-for-1 reanimation spell that we can possibly see again thanks to our card tutoring effects and deck shuffling. Rishkar's Expertise has us draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control, and then has us cast a CMC 5 spell from our hand for free, allowing us to get a whole lot of card advantage thanks to our creature's high stats and usually letting us reanimate another creature thanks to the free spell it provides. That's it for all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have Font of Fertility, which lets us pay 1 a green and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, serving as some good ramp to drop early and still passable in the later game. The CMC 2 slot then gives us Animate Dead, an aura that enchants a creature in our graveyard, returning it into play, giving it -1/-0, and having us sack the creature should Animate Dead leave play, making it a cheap reanimation spell whose minor downsides still make it worth running. Then skipping to the CMC 4 slot, we have Greater Good, which has us sack a creature, draw cards equal to its power, then discard 3 cards, allowing us to take advantage of creatures that would be removed anyway by turning them into card advantage, while also letting us dump any creatures we may have drawn into our graveyard to be reanimated later if we can't cast them ourselves. Finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot, we get to our last enchantment with the Eldest Reborn, a saga whose first chapter has each opponent sack a creature or planeswalker, its second chapter having each opponent discard a card, and whose last chapter puts a creature or planeswalker from any graveyard into play under our control, serving as a somewhat slow reanimation spell that makes up for it by disrupting our opponent's board states and hand as it comes online. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. The CMC 1 slot sees our only artifact, that being Soul Ring, a mana rock that taps for 2 colorless, which we'll be running in order to use that early mana boost to get our commander to dump even more creatures into our grave sooner, and get to our bigger reanimation spells even faster. So with our artifact covered, and since we have no planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Llanowar Wastes, which taps for a colorless or either our colors if we take a damage, Necroblossom Snarl, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a forest or swamp and taps for either of our colors, Tainted Wood, which taps for colorless or either of our colors if we control a swamp, Temple of Malady, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, Woodland Chasm, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and counts as both a swamp and a forest, Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 basic lands of the same type from our deck into play tapped, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. For utility lands, we'll be running Bajuga Bog, Ghost Quarter, and Gyre Reach Sanitarium. Bajuga Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and exiles an opponent's graveyard when it ETBs, making it a good source of player-specific graveyard hate in the land slot. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and lets us tap it and sack it to destroy target land, letting its controller replace it with a basic from their deck, serving as a good removal option to deal with our opponent's utility lands. Gaia Reach Sanitarium also taps for a colorless, and we can pay 2 and tap it to have all players draw a card, then discard a card, giving us a way to dig through our deck for more reanimation spells and pitch any creatures we may have drawn into to reanimate as we do so. Lastly, we're running 12 swamps and 12 forests as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 15 creatures including the commander, 11 instants, 33 sorceries, 4 enchantments, 1 artifact, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 14 CMC 5+ creatures, 15 single target reanimation spells, 7 2+ target reanimation spells once or over time, 2 repeatable sources of reanimation, and 5 sources of graveyard setup, giving us a good core of big creatures to use our plethora of reanimation effects to recur over and over again, while cherry-picking our deck in our hand to dump said creatures into our graveyard as quickly as possible. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 9 card draw sources, 15 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, having some slight variation in the draw and removal department but being within acceptable parameters overall. Looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 11 2-drops, 13 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 11 5-drops, 6 6-drops, 6 7-drops, 2 8-drops, and 1 9-drop, giving us a mid to late game curve which is faster than it actually appears thanks to our commander's efficiency in dumping our high CMC creatures in the bin for us to reanimate at a much lower cost. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.31, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, some more reanimation targets such as Gravewalker, Burning Rune Demon, and Archfiend of Depravity would be great additions, all of them having big stats, being evasive, and granting us more reanimation, tutoring, and removal respectively. More mass reanimation effects could also find a home here, such as Boneyard Parlay and Haunting Voyage, to take advantage of our ability to fill our graveyard with big creatures and our high volume of demons. For upgrades, Doom Whisperer, Lord of the Void, and Archon of Cruelty all make good evasive reanimation targets to get in for damage while possessing good utility. Sheoldred Whispering One, Kakusho the Evening Star, and Razaketh the Foul-Blooded are even better reanimation targets if we're willing to pay the additional price for them. And Dance of the Dead, Reanimate, and Necromancy are all potent sources of reanimation to get our creatures into play even faster. Finally, Mikaeus the Unhallowed is a heavy hitter that makes all our creatures that much harder to kill thanks to his AoE Undying effect and pumps them even further to boot, so long as we're willing to pay the fee to dig him up again. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Slugurk the Overslime has taken the top spot, so look forward to a land-centric build featuring this oozy boy next week. Moving on to next week's poll, as per your suggestions, we'll be giving the alternate commanders from the precon some love, so this lineup will be consisting of Lind, Cheerful Tormentor, Eloise, Nephalia Sleuth, and Kyler, Sigardian Emissary. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from Midnight Hunt you'd like to see in a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, feel free to buy me a coffee in the link in the description. Also, feel free to check out the other deck text floating around my head if you want to see the latest builds or the playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.